which doesn't block any of your own. Like the knight on d3 is simply a good piece. It doesn't get in the way of any of white's pieces. It also gains a tempo,
Right.
in a sense, because black doesn't want to give up that bishop or trade off that bishop on c5 for the knight on d3. That would lead to a two bishops advantage. We saw the importance of that two bishops advantage, even for a pawn, in the first game.
Yep.
Magnus obviously values the two bishops, so don't give it to him for free. And I think we'll very likely see bishop to b6 there.
Let's look at knight d3, because I want to come back to the idea you mentioned earlier, which it not as effective as it potentially was when the knight was on d5. But what about your a4 idea again? Is this still something to consider? Obviously, it doesn't threaten a5 in the same way because the knight and bishop are here. But the other points to the move in regards to gaining a little bit of potential space, adding some tension, the exchange here, of course, would bring the rook to maybe an even more dangerous spot now that the knight's not on d5. Maybe this is a plan Magnus can go for.
Although I wonder if black can ignore it and play a move like rook to d8. Because after rook, say f d8,
Just gonna give me
8
the
takes
pawn.
b5, knight d4, you can't take my knight on d4 because then I skewer your queen and your rook with the bishop. And otherwise I could take back on b5. I'm threatening to take on f3, which would win a piece.
Well, Robert, one small tactic.
Yes.
White can actually take on d4.
It's true.
Bishop takes d4 and queen a3. And white is a pawn up. It might be very close to level anyway because those are doubled pawns, and the pawn on b5 is going to be tough to defend for white.
Right.
But it's something to consider. White does keep the pawn at least momentarily here. But this is an interesting idea because black is interested in concrete play. He's happy to force the situation rather than play a long game. And we've seen this as an intention of Jan in some of the games, that he goes for concrete solutions rather than playing a slow maneuvering game against Magnus.
We have action, and we do have knight d3.
We have knight to d3,
So-
bishop b6, and I think a4 is the most natural, maybe even the best move for white. At least you give that decision to black, because I think b takes a4, rook takes a4 is a slight improvement for white's position.
Yep.
It's not a structural improvement, but it's a piece activity improvement. That rook on a4 is developed without having to move any white's pieces out of the way. It's just developed on, not a starting square, but basically on a square that you normally don't develop rooks to, right? You normally expect you play like rook ac1, rook ad1. You don't expect the rook is developed via a4.
Although I respect that rook lift so much that I don't want to allow the activity. So that's why I'm still sticking with that rook d8 move. I really believe that if you put on your calculation cap, that this position, even with queen to a3, black can play queen d7 perhaps, and just say, I'm not going to trade queens, and your rook's under attack, b5 is hanging, I'm going to trade light square bishops, and it seems like we're just in a level position. We both will have 5 pawns remaining, 2 minor pieces, and I think that if Jan can find a way that he doesn't have to have questions remaining, he'll go for that, and this seems to be a variation that succeeds.
Unlike you, I left my calculation cap at home. I didn't want it to mess with my hair, So, your thoughts, Bob?
Well, your hair is looking...
Your hair looks... You're looking fresh.
Thanks, Danny. Besides that, I just wanted to go a bit deeper into the variation we were just looking at.
What?
We don't know what you're talking about, Robert. All right, knight d3 played. Go ahead, Bob.
So in the final position we just saw...
Bishop e7, a4, Robert's line of rook d8. Okay, knight d4. Robert, you're looking so good, man. All right, queen a3, queen d7.
I totally agree that this is equalizing for black, and it's probably the best approach for black after a4. But we should consider the line a bit longer just to see what Jan has to calculate a bit. Knight c5 here is a move.
Ooh.
And now black should play bishop takes c5, queen takes c5. So white still keeps that pawn for the moment. But after bishop takes g2, king takes g2, queen to b7, probably among other moves.
You have rook d5 coming. I was going to point out that maybe even the endgame is fine for... Oh, no, there's b6 there, the a-pawn spin. Okay, I'll show...
There might be multiple ways to gain...
I'll show my blunder because Robert looked at me and I need to... just for everyone else,
Maybe queen to b7 is not even the most accurate because of queen c6. I just noticed. But there's probably a very concrete way of getting that pawn back and simplifying to a position where, the minor pieces have been traded off. The a pawn is a bit weak, but the b3 pawn will also be weak.
Yeah.
So we might see a roughly level position here. But I think queen to b7 isn't the right move.
Can you just go rook b8?
Rook d to b8?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's...
Still get the pawn.
Although maybe there's b6, actually.
Queen for 2 rooks?
Queen b6, queen to b7.
Yeah.
But
You give a check first.
I'm still wondering, is there queen to c6?
What a weird move. Can't take with the rook because a8 hangs. Can't take with the queen because a pass pawn remains.
Well, you can, and you can take on b3, but
No,
that
you don't
c
want
pawn,
that. You
so
don't
that
want
c pawn looks dangerous.
Yeah.
So
Oh, and you know what? If you queen b7, which is like, I'm just going to try to win that pawn, you might have like rook a5 and just hold on to that pawn for dear life.
You know, this potential of a pass c pawn reminds me of a dream that Fabiano had last night. You want to share it with the chat? So tell us how deep down this commentary rabbit hole you are.
normally I don't dream about chess, but last night I had a chess dream, and it was about this game. And in my dream, Jan won.
Okay.
And the way he won
I
was
don't know why I laughed at that, but okay.
Magnus simplified to a king and pawn endina, and it was like white has king on c4.
Yeah.
In the dream, for some reason, Jan was white.
Okay.
But let's ignore that. White had king on c4, black had like a king on a8, and white had a pawn on a2. And Magnus was like, all right,
It's a draw.
it's a draw. But then Jan played the move a2 to b3. And Magnus looked surprised, but he was like, okay, I played king to b7. And then Jan played b2 to c3.
Just move the pawn over.
It wasn't exactly like that. I just realized that what I just described was a draw. But in any case, Jan moved his pawn from the A file to the C file, and Magnus suddenly looked really upset and surprised, and he just resigned.
Well,
What else could he
in
do?
this analysis we're going, where did this pawn go? It went from the A file to the C file, which is why I remember, by the way, when you pick up your fellow commentators at about 3:50 a.m., these are the things we talk about. Hey, Bobby, how'd it go? Well, I had a weird dream last night. So, all right, Robert, go ahead. Get us back to the chess.
No, I got nothing for you. You know, you've already made it clear you just want to talk to Fabiano. So
Okay.
I'm just going to sit here silently. You know, I've been trying to predict the moves.
Yeah.
I called some of it, and
You're doing great. Honestly, you've been all over it. And you've been complimentary of Jan and his aggressive play.
no, honestly, because in game 2, when he did have that advantage, and he said in the press conference, I was afraid of some things. And that made me worried for his overall chances, because you can't play afraid against
Right.
Magnus Carlsen.
Right.
But here he's showing that he's not scared. He entered an opening that he wasn't prepared for, and yet that's what happens when they're super grandmasters at play. They can find amazing moves over the board. And b5 shocked all of us, and Yasser Seirawan was there calling for b5. But it's really a strategically counterintuitive move. When there's a bishop on g2 staring down the length of the diagonal to play that, that's really impressive stuff. And then he goes knight c6 as the retreat. And it's not just because I've been advocating for the move. I think he's really making sure that his life is not going to be tremendously difficult. And we're at a position where Magnus is the one struggling to find any semblance of an edge.
Yeah, if you're just tuning in, we'll bring up the second board real quick just to show the critical moves that Robert was just talking about. It was this move 11b5 that was played by Jan that, again, was called for and called counterintuitive by Grandmaster Yasser Seirawan in chat, and he was correct. Robert called it maybe the best move Jan has played at this point in the World Championship, and from here on out, it's been all the best moves that Fabiano and Hess have been predicting, and Jan's been finding them, has himself in yet another. Bobby, you said it's too early to call this an opening win yet for Jan and his team, but are you ready to say now that Black clearly did fine after the first stage?
Yeah, I think we can comfortably say that Jan did very well in the opening, mostly through good play, because I don't think that he was ready for this line.
Yeah.
But knight c6, b5, these were both good decisions and good moves. And
yeah, even knight c6 earlier. In fact, I should mention that. You're right, because the novelty from Magnus was this pawn sacrifice for those who just tuned in. But Jan said, no, thank you. Just let the pawn be taken back, and then b5. So, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I think it's important that they're not only good moves, because c takes b3, we might say, is also a good move, because it doesn't lead to a bad position for Black, most likely. But knight c6 is a good decision, because it takes the game into a position which Jan can more easily calculate. And we know that he planned b5 in advance when he played knight c6. He thought a lot about knight c6, not so much about b5.
Right.
So he had this in mind, and he knew that it was, and look at the time he spent on all the moves after that. He played extremely
Almost
quickly.
nothing.
So he was ready. Everything was planned in advance when he played this knight c6 move. Now we see Magnus playing rather quickly bishop to g5, which the first indication is that he's ready to give up the bishop pair. to slightly damage black's structure. For example, h6 here.
Rook d8's already been played.
Jan
so
played too quickly for,
well,
us to
too
get
quickly
into
for me to
h6.
even analyze. And now after rook d8, the same line you could. We'll just go for the line you were saying.
Yeah, if white plays bishop f6 here, which I think is maybe a bit premature, we have an ending where black has